Welcome to Module 6. This is the discussion of the language of the preschooler. So this week's vocabulary includes MLU, which stands for mean length of utterance, morpheme, narratives, heaps, primitive narrative, recounts, pragmatics, and discourse. As you read through the text, make sure that you're paying particular attention to these terms so that they become familiar with, or you become familiar with their definitions. So the preschool years, sometimes people think or imagine the preschool years as being filled with the terrible twos or the temper tantrums of the three. And I really like to think of it not as terrible, but terrific, that these are remarkable years of growth in so many ways for young children. We see them being able to make independent choices, and that's really the root of where their assertiveness comes from, where they are asserting their will. They are making their own independent decisions. They are communicating with others in their environment about their own ideas and feelings, and learning how to negotiate and manage the social interactions that they deal with on a daily basis. They are extremely curious. They are great imitators. Their play is intense and demonstrates their understanding of how the world works. We start to see in the preschool years, children are really getting a good grasp of grammar. In fact, to such a degree that they overgeneralize the rules of grammar. So if they start to understand that ED tells you about past tense, they may take ED and add it to many verbs to indicate past tense, whether those particular verbs use ED endings or not. They are mobile. They are busy learning to jump and run and spin and ride bikes and climb, and they are conversationalists, not just with their parents, but with the other children that they interact with in their environment. So when we talk about the preschool years, what we're going to talk about is as the child moves from their second birthday through their fourth birthday. And while their first 2 years of life were spent developing sounds and words, the next 2 years of life are going to be spent focusing on developing social communication through conversation. And they're going to be developing language in terms of both its form, its content, and its use or purpose. So as I said, when we're talking about vocabulary, and I mentioned it, MLU, you do need to know that MLU stands for mean length of utterance. As a speech language pathologist, it is important, or a speech language pathology assistant, it is important for you to understand how to collect a language sample that would tell us what the mean length of utterance is of a child. So as the 2-year-old starts to combine words together, we begin to start looking at their MLU. And looking at their MLU tells us how their language is growing. Adding 2 words together, daddy go, baby up, truck crash, shows us the babies, preschoolers start to understand that words in our language have order, and that words in our language have a function beyond just labeling. So we use MLU to measure language growth. We use it to measure specifically morphological and syntactic growth. Do you remember from our first conversations about vocabulary that morphology you can think of as grammar and syntax you can think of as word order? When we talk about MLU, we're talking about the average length of a child's utterances. And in order to measure MLU, you must count the number of morphemes in a collection of utterances. A morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit of language. So, in the word book, there is one morpheme, book. In the word books, there are two, book and s. S is a morpheme that changes the meaning of the word book to more than one. The s is what we call a bound morpheme, and book is an unbound morpheme, meaning book, being unbound, can stand by itself. The s is bound because it must be attached to an existing morpheme in order for it to have meaning. When we collect a sample of a child's language, we write down all the words that they say. We write down all of the questions they ask, the comments they make, and then we count how many morphemes are in each utterance. When we divide the number of utterances by the morphemes used, we'll get the average MLU. And this is a tool that's used by speech-language pathologists across the nation. So I gave you a very brief description there about morphemes. So let's look again. If language samples measure MLU, and MLU measures language growth, and specifically we're measuring the syntactic and morphological growth, we have to look at the morphemes of the child's language. Morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning in language. And just as I said in the example of books, there are two kinds of morphemes, bound and unbound. Grammatical morphemes modify words. So it can change a word from present tense to past. It can change from singular to plural. An unbound morpheme are those that have meaning on their own. Here are some examples: cat, walk, of, silly. Bound morphemes are those that must be attached to another in order to carry meaning. Ing, ed, ness, s. So let's look at calculating MLU. What exactly does it look like? The example on the left will show you both what the child is saying and the clinician. The column on the right will show you the morpheme count. So in the sentence, I do it, Ben is using 3 morphemes. Ben then says, no, I stirred it. Stirred counts as 2, stir and d. So no is 1, then I is 1, stir is 1, d is 1, and it is 1, for a total of 5. Ben then says, him fall off top. That's 4 morphemes. Ben then said at last, now it goes fast. Goes is 2 because go and the z. So you add all the morphemes and divide by the utterances. There were 17 morphemes and 4 utterances. So the MLU would be 4.25. That's the average sentence length or utterance length for Ben. Now, when we're calculating MLU, you would certainly collect a sample that is longer than just 4 sentences or 4 utterances of a child. In fact, we try to collect 50 to 100 utterances from the child in order to truly say we have an average. There's a kind of a quick trick to thinking about MLU. Typically, the MLU is very close to a chronological age. So for a child that's between, say, 27 to 30 months of age, we would expect their average sentence length to be between 2 and 2.5. If they were closer to their 3rd birthday, their MLU would also be closer to 3. And as they hit their 3rd birthday at 36 months, their MLU will be between 3.0 and 3.75, meaning sometimes they use sentences that are 2 words in length, Sometimes they use sentences that are 4 and 5 words in length for an average of between 3 and 3.75. Remember, MLU doesn't say the longest sentence they say. It simply describes the average sentence length. After about 5 years old, we tend to not use MLU to describe a child's language any longer. The reason for that being is if a child is developing typically, we would expect that their language is now quite complex. And so it has prepositional phrases and conditional statements and tags, such that it would no longer be meaningful to use the MLU as a measurement tool. During the preschool years, we are going to look at morphological growth. In fact, there's a lot that happens in morphology and grammar during the preschool years. Preschoolers are going to acquire a whole bunch of very specific morphological markers. So remember, by their second birthday, we want them to be putting 2 words together. But very quickly, they learn to add articles. I want a cookie. They learn to add conjunctions. Me and daddy. They learn to add negation. I don't want it. No cookie. Sentence complexity includes the addition of these things through question forms. They learn to not just use inflection, I go outside, but they learn to ask, can I go outside? Can I have one? And they learn to put the can in first. They learn politeness markers. I can have a cookie, please. They learn plurals and pronouns. I, you, me. Although some of their mistakes can still be quite vivid in that they may use him and he and his incorrectly. That's him's cookie. She's done it. The greatest change will be in their use of verb and verb tense. So while those 2 words together will have meaning at 2, then 3rd and 4th year, they'll be really moving towards adding meaning using verb tense, whether they're talking about happening right now or something that has already happened. They'll even acquire the auxiliary verbs to be and to have. That's the little verbs that happen before the verbs, such as I am walking, he is standing. Is and am are considered auxiliary verbs. They're in addition to the acquired verb tense. There's also remarkable achievements in content in the preschool years. Their vocabulary knowledge is growing rapidly. Preschoolers gain understanding even after one time of hearing a new word. But just like when they were little, fast mapping is going to continue. So when they experience a new word, the more often they hear that word in a short period of time with additional meaning, they will build on their understanding of what that word actually means, and they'll start to get more and more specifics of how that a word grows in their understanding. Most of the time, their understanding grows from things that are very general to something much more specific or personal. So while the picture on the left, they'll all say butterflies, maybe as they get a little bit older and they start to understand, well, no, this one is a monarch butterfly, and that is distinctly different than just all the others. Different children show different interests in different topics, and therefore their ability to use these more specific terms will be based off of experience, based off of exposure, and based off of personal interest. Have you ever met a little one who is very interested in trains or dinosaurs or planes, and they can tell you the very specific names and features of each of those objects? So fast mapping. What exactly is that? It's when a child gathers information about a new word. They take that information that they've learned during that first exposure and they store it. When they encounter the word again, they store additional information. So, snowman gets added to winter and sledding fun and snowflakes and snowboarding and snowshoeing. And they start to tie all the pieces together that are snowman. They learn carrot and arms and snowballs, and all of these things are added together to their knowledge of snowman so that their knowledge and understanding of what snowman is becomes more firm. Children gather information from context, from how it's used in a book, from their experience, and clues that they pick up on from conversation. The best way to solidify a word for a child is to expose them to it frequently over a period of several days. Effective caregivers can enhance a child's vocabulary knowledge by allowing them opportunities to encounter new words repeatedly. They set the environment up for learning. One of the other grammar changes in a young preschooler is the emergence of negation. And between 27 to 30 months old, we start to see very specific uses of negation. First, for non existence, when something is all gone, cookie all gone, rejection, no peas, and they turn their head away from the spoon that's coming up their mouth. Denial, which expresses a disagreement. So if mommy says that's a kitty, baby says, no kitty, that horsey. So denial is a different type of negation. As preschoolers grow from 31 to 46 months, they begin to really learn how to tell stories. Now, part of this is their exposure to literature, exposure to the story narrative, exposure to role models or caregivers that also are good storytellers. These skills change rapidly, and the essence of the story becomes how eventually they'll learn to have conversations. So the story or the story narrative is developed during this period of time, as is conversational discourse. So if you've ever tried to listen to a young child tell a story, often you'll have the experience where the child doesn't have the structure necessary in order to get the beginning, middle, and end of the story out, or they don't tell the story in sequence, or they're missing the vocabulary or content with which to tell you the story, or perhaps they don't have the way of finishing the story, or they are missing the pieces such as plot or problem or resolution, such that a story is not just a statement of a fact, but that actually an evolution of a narrative. So let's watch this little boy describe why stories are so very hard.
Have you ever had a dream that you had you you could you do you want you could do so you do you want him to do you so much you could do anything?
That pretty much sums it up. Young children often have a very hard time learning and using the story narrative. Developing narratives starts with just a few sentences. Often some of the problems we see with young preschoolers is their stories go round and round in circles, are extremely repetitive, they don't have a sequence, and they don't necessarily even have a story content. It's just telling you something, such as, I ate an apple. I like oranges. And they're not really understanding that the connection between the sentences builds through a story process. When we hear stories from 2 to 3-year-olds, they have a lot of assumed shared knowledge. So while they are acquiring words such as pronouns, it, I, you, they, those words get embedded into the story such that the listener, if they haven't had the same experience as the child, may lose track of what's happening. He did it, and then I did it, and then they said, no, I can't. And the child assumes that you have the same shared understanding of what they are referring to. As they grow in their ability to take perspective, that is, looking at life through someone else's eyes, their ability to tell the story improves. A child who's very good at telling stories is often the child that we see who does well academically. All of life is a story. If you think about how we talk about the digestive system, it still has a sequence, a beginning, middle, and an end. If we talk about the Civil War, it has a sequence with characters, a plot, resolution. The essence of the story is crucial to academic success. Narrative stages go through specific patterns of how children tell stories. In a heap, a child tells a story that has completely unrelated information. They're connected in a string, but there's no defined sequence. So it's similar to the I like oranges, I ate an apple, it's all gone. Primitive narratives, they do contain story elements such as a beginning and often something that happened, but they seem to struggle with the resolution, or there is no resolution, or the end comes swiftly. An unfocused chain has almost the appearance of a story, but again, drifts often with an unfocused sequence or resolution. Recounts are stories of events in which the child participated. And this is the type of story we see most often. What did you do at school? What did you do at grandma's house? Child comes in the house and they're crying. Tell me what happened. A recount is often what we will experience. Let's look at this. And what kind of story do you think this might be?
My mama used to read me bedtime stories, but we can only read 4. But then I have coffee switch. Then I can turn the lights out. Then I have a car light. Then I could turn it on. Then it won't be afraid of the dark.
Oh, that's pretty cool. That is really cool.
Okay, so let's think about that, right? He's trying to talk about stories. We hear something about somebody telling him a story and that mommy's doing it, and that you can turn off the light and not be afraid of the dark. So let's look back. In a heap, the information is unrelated but connected with a string, no sequence, and a primitive narrative contains an element sort of initializing an event with an action but no real end to the story. So the unfocused chain has the illusion of the story but drifts without sequence or ending. So I would say this child is demonstrating something between a primitive narrative and an unfocused chain. So there's a chain of events. You hear him trying to link these pieces together, but the ending doesn't really match up with what the beginning of the story intended. Another development during the preschool years is pragmatics, the social rules of what to say, when to say it, and how to engage with others. During the 4th year of life, between 36 months and 46 months, the young child is going to learn so much about the art of communication. In fact, we know that they can recognize by this age a pause of greater than a second means that this conversation isn't going to continue. They know that a pause of less than a second means the conversation will continue. And they can take turns, 2 easily, and often even more if the topic is interesting to them. When they perceive a listener doesn't understand them or is having trouble, they will add information to what they've told the listener. If the conversational partner or listener asks what, they will revise what they've said and change it, or they may just repeat exactly what they said. They do fine with two-way conversations, but they start to struggle when three people are involved. Keeping up with the triad is difficult. So school days are coming. Most kids in the United States start school at 5 years old, but certainly between the ages of 48 months and 5 years old. Some states start at 4. And the reason for that is by 46 months of age, just shy of their 4th birthday, a typically developing child has already mastered the basics of language. Think about that. They've been here for just under 4 years, and they have mastered how we use language to communicate with others through conversation and beginning stories. They know how and when and why to speak to people, at least a basic understanding of that. They've developed grammar. They combine words together in the correct order in order to send messages that include thoughts and feelings and ideas that are independent of that which they have been told or been asked to say. Their speech sound system, it has been acquired such that what they say is understood by people who are unfamiliar with them. They understood the sounds that we use in language and how we combine those sounds to make syllables and words. So they've done a lot. They have mastered the basics of our language. But there's much more to come as they enter school. And over the next few years, their vocabulary and their ability to engage socially is going to grow immensely. And soon, this little one is going to be a true conversationalist. We'll see you next week as we talk about the school years.